In the first weeks of 1990, the divorce of a Czechoslovak-born skier and a New York property developer took over the front pages of the city's tabloid newspapers for 11 consecutive days. The woman at the center of that coverage crossed out of the Eastern Bloc on a marriage of convenience, rebuilt her life on 2 continents, ran a casino resort in Atlantic City, and managed one of the most recognizable hotels in Manhattan. Almost none of that reached the front pages, which wanted the other story. So how much of what she told the world about herself survives examination? And what became of the 3 children who watched the marriage come apart from inside the family's Trump Tower apartment? Ivana Marie Zelničková entered the world on February 20, 1949, in Zlín, an industrial Czechoslovak town that officials would shortly rename Gottwaldov. Communist rule shaped her childhood in a country where the western border functioned less as a line on a map than as a lock. Her father pushed her towards sport from an early age, and she developed into a competitive skier of genuine ability, which in that place and that decade amounted to rather more than a hobby, since athletes belonged to one of the few groups of citizens with any realistic prospect of crossing that border. Skiing decided the rest of her life. Life in post-war Czechoslovakia narrowed sharply for anyone whose ambitions clashed with the state's plans for them. Private enterprise disappeared and careers depended on political standing, while permission to leave the country arrived slowly when it arrived at all. Sport occupied an odd position inside that system. Athletes carried national prestige abroad and mixed with foreigners in a way ordinary workers almost never managed, which explains why athletic careers turn up so often in the emigration stories of the period. Skiing carried her out of Czechoslovakia and into Canada, then into a New York marriage, and, as we shall soon see, onto the Colorado slope, where that marriage effectively ended. That through line disappears easily, because the second half of her life resembles the first so little. Whatever else changed around her, skiing stayed. For decades, one line appeared in nearly every profile written about her. An alternate for the Czechoslovakian national ski team at the 1972 Winter Olympics in Sapporo. Donald Trump repeated it in interviews. Ivana repeated it herself, in conversation and in publicity material, and the claim hardened into accepted fact through repetition rather than through any documentation anyone could produce. Sports historians dispute it to this day. The most direct challenge arrived in 1989 when Spy magazine looked into the story and put the question to the Czechoslovakian Olympic Committee itself. Back came an unambiguous answer. Petr Pomezny, at that time the committee's Secretary General, told the magazine that his staff searched their records extensively and found nothing indicating that she ever belonged to the team. Journalists returned to the question later, notably Snopes in July 2021, and no paperwork supporting the Olympic version has surfaced in all the years since Spy first asked. We cannot be entirely sure what lies behind the discrepancy. Reserves and alternates do sometimes leave a thin paper trail, particularly within state sporting bureaucracies, whose archives changed hands more than once across the second half of the 20th century. And an absence of evidence does not quite equal evidence of absence. What the episode reveals concerns the way the couple assembled a public story. An Olympic line gave her biography a shape that ski instruction in Montreal could not, and once it entered circulation, nobody with an interest in the marriage found any reason to correct it. Leaving Czechoslovakia legally took more than a decision to go. Emigration demanded paperwork, official permission, a reason the authorities would accept, and usually a wait of unpredictable length, and for a young woman without political connections, the ordinary routes stayed shut. Ivana found a way around the problem in 1971. In Prague that year, she married Alfred Winkelmeyer, an Austrian friend and ski instructor, in an arrangement both of them understood as a transaction rather than a romance. The arrangement worked exactly as intended. Marriage to an Austrian entitled her to an Austrian passport, and an Austrian passport let her leave the Eastern Bloc legally and permanently. She and Winkelmeyer divorced in 1973, the document having done its work. An unsentimental clarity runs through the whole maneuver, and it returns 2 decades later at a very different table, because a woman who negotiated her way out of a closed country at 22 rarely loses a negotiation to anybody. Arrangements of this sort turn up often among people trying to get out of the Eastern Bloc, and they carried risk on both sides of the bargain. Winkelmeyer acquired a legal spouse along with whatever complications followed, while Ivana gambled that the paperwork would survive inspection by officials with every reason to refuse it. Her half of it stayed brief and businesslike. The passport came through and the exit followed, and the marriage dissolved in 1973 without a trace of the acrimony that would surround her second divorce. After Europe, she settled in Montreal, where she taught skiing and picked up runway modeling work. Canada gave her an income and a professional foothold in a Western city. Montreal held her only briefly. By the mid-1970s, she moved on to New York, a city that rewarded precisely the combination she carried: an accent, a look, an athletic career behind her, and no visible interest in apologizing for any of it. Ivana met Donald Trump in New York in 1976 during a trip connected to the promotion of that year's Montreal Olympics. He worked in property development at the start of the run that would put his surname across the city's business pages. She arrived as a model with a Canadian base and a complicated passport history behind her. They married in April 1977. The Olympic Games brought the two of them together, and an Olympic credential no committee could verify would follow her for the remainder of her life. The speed of the ascent must have disoriented even her. 6 years separated the Prague wedding that bought her a passport from the New York wedding that put her surname on the skyline, and the distance covered in those 6 years cannot be measured in miles. She crossed from a system that rationed permission into one that rationed almost nothing except money. Nothing in Got Waldorf prepared anyone for the second system, and she learned it quickly enough to run a casino resort within a decade of arriving. 3 children followed the wedding: Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric. All 3 grew up inside the Trump Tower apartment, in a household built around a business that carried their surname on the outside of the building. Ivana did not disappear into that household. Her role in the company expanded steadily through the 1980s until she held titles with nothing ceremonial about them, an unusual position for a wife in that world, and one that shaped what she could demand when the marriage came apart. Through the 1980s, the Trumps became fixtures of New York's social and business circles, photographed at openings and treated by the city's press as a kind of running serial with new installments every week. Ivana played no decorative part in that arrangement. She worked as a corporate asset inside her husband's real estate empire, holding the title of Vice President of Interior Design for the Trump Organization, and her design sensibility drove the opulent look that became the signature of Trump Tower itself. Her responsibilities grew well past design. She took the roles of chief executive and president of Trump's Castle, the casino resort in Atlantic City, running the casino in an industry that at the time promoted very few women to that level. Casino management admits no honorary appointments. Gaming regulators and several hundred employees sat between her office and the floor, and she held the position while her children remained small and lived in another state. From Atlantic City, she moved to the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, taking over management of one of the most photographed buildings in the country. The trajectory sits oddly beside the description that would soon attach to her. Newspapers covering the divorce framed her almost entirely as a wronged wife and a former model, while the record of the preceding decade showed a working executive with a casino and a landmark hotel on her resume. Both descriptions circulated at once, and the louder one won. The arrangement carried a contradiction that neither of them appears to have thought through while the marriage held. Ivana worked as a senior executive inside a company her husband owned and controlled, which tied her professional standing and her marriage to a single foundation. Her husband owned her employer. A wife can leave a marriage, and an executive can leave a company. But doing both at once, in public, while the owner of that company keeps the press relationships that shape how the story gets told, amounts to another proposition entirely, and 1990 demonstrated exactly how much so. The marriage began to fracture visibly in 1989 amid Donald Trump's affair with Marla Maples. Whatever private accommodation the couple reached collapsed in December of that year in Aspen, Colorado, when Ivana and Maples encountered one another on the ski slopes, and half a resort witnessed the confrontation that followed. The setting carries its own irony. Skiing, the thing that carried Ivana out of Czechoslovakia and gave her a profession on 2 continents, delivered the scene that ended her marriage. Aspen in the final week of December drew precisely the crowd least likely to keep quiet about what they saw, and an account of the encounter reached New York faster than either party could construct a story capable of containing it. The gossip columns ran it within days, and the front pages followed. Nothing about the separation that followed would proceed privately, because by that point, no part of the marriage remained private in any meaningful sense. Marla Maples entered the story as the other woman and stayed inside the coverage for years afterwards. The Aspen encounter gave the New York press something no anonymous tip could match, since it delivered 2 named women, 1 famous husband, and a public setting full of witnesses willing to talk about what they saw. Ivana returned to a marriage already finished in everything but paperwork. Whatever calculations she ran in the days that followed, she ran them as the same person who negotiated her way out of Czechoslovakia at 22, and the negotiation ahead of her would last considerably longer. What came next amounted to a media event with little precedent, even in a city that spent a decade covering this particular couple. The divorce held the front pages of the New York tabloids for 11 consecutive days in early 1990, a run that pushed municipal politics, crime, and everything else into the interior of the papers. For a divorce, 11 days verged on unprecedented. A run of that length reaches everywhere. Every newsstand in the city and every subway carriage carried some version of her marriage on paper for a week and a half. And the coverage did not stop at the end of the 11th day, but simply migrated from the front page to the inside pages. Her children lived inside it too. She still held her titles inside the company while the story ran, which meant walking into a building that carried her husband's name, past vendors, selling the details of their separation. The most notorious artifact of the frenzy ran in the New York Post, a headline in which Maples purportedly described Trump as the best sex I've ever had. That qualifier has never come off, since no confirmed account of Maples speaking those words in that form ever emerged. The headline stuck anyway. It became shorthand for the entire affair, and it reduced a woman who still held a senior title inside her husband's company to a punchline printed in headline type. Tabloid culture in New York at the turn of the 1990s ran on exactly this material: money, sex, real estate, and a couple who spent years opening themselves to reporters. The Trumps cultivated that press deliberately during the profitable decade. When the marriage failed, the same relationships that produced flattering coverage produced the opposite, and neither of them could switch the machine off. The legal proceedings turned bitter quickly. In a sworn deposition during the divorce, Ivana accused her husband of rape, describing an incident from 1989, and the accusation traveled from a legal document into general circulation with startling speed. Once it surfaced publicly, it attached itself permanently to both of their names. The fullest account of the episode appeared in Harry Hurt III's 1993 biography, Lost Tycoon, published by W.W. Norton. Hurt placed the incident on a night when Donald Trump suffered severe physical pain and raged at his wife following an unsuccessful scalp reduction procedure carried out by a plastic surgeon Ivana herself recommended. The detail sounds almost absurd written down. In Hurt's telling, the surgery supplies the immediate context surrounding what Ivana described under oath rather than any kind of explanation for it, and a reason and an excuse remain separate things. Ivana later issued a public statement about the deposition. Her statement described feeling violated and acknowledged her use of the word rape, while asking that nobody take the word in a literal or criminal sense. Readers have taken that clarification in opposite directions ever since. Some treat it as an honest account of what she always meant, others as a settlement-era retreat by a woman who already traded a great deal for peace, and we cannot be sure which reading holds, since nothing beyond the two documents themselves ever settled the question. One hesitates to compress an episode of this kind into a single sentence. Divorce depositions belong to an adversarial process shaped by legal strategy, and public clarifications issued in the middle of settlement negotiations pass through lawyers on both sides, so neither document opens a plain window onto 1989. The accusation entered the public record through sworn testimony, and it never left public discussion afterwards. Money produced the ending. Ivana contested the prenuptial agreements the couple signed, and the challenge worked well enough to shift the negotiation onto ground she could fight on. Both sides reached a settlement in the spring of 1991. The courts finalized the divorce in 1992, closing 15 years of marriage and roughly 2 years of litigation conducted in front of an audience of millions. The terms came to around $14 million, structured as a $10 million certified check together with a $4 million guarantee payable once she vacated the Trump Tower apartment. She also received a 45-room mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, an apartment in Trump Plaza, and the use of the Mar-a-Lago estate for 1 month every year. Child support ran to $650,000 a year. The Mar-a-Lago clause left an ex-wife with a standing annual claim on a property her former husband would keep for the rest of his public life. Figures of that size get quoted without much thought about what produced them. Prenuptial agreements exist to prevent exactly the outcome she obtained, and contesting them successfully enough to reach a settlement on that scale required either a strong legal position or pressure of some other kind. We cannot know how much weight the deposition carried in those negotiations. The sworn testimony and the financial bargaining occupied the same months and the same lawyers, and she walked away with more than the documents she signed permitted her. Ivana kept custody. She raised the children after the divorce and later took primary credit for it, pointing out that she controlled their schooling and their allowances until each of them finished college. Whatever one makes of that claim, the arrangement put the daily decisions of 3 childhoods in her hands throughout the years that formed them. The separation landed hardest on the eldest. Donald Jr. refused to speak to his father for a year afterwards, a silence long enough to enter the family's public history rather than remain a private grievance. Children of famous marriages usually absorb the damage out of sight. In this family, the damage arrived in newspapers their classmates read on the way to school, which produced a particular kind of adolescence. Donald Trump Jr. took a bachelor's degree in finance and real estate from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, then joined the Trump Organization in 2001 as an executive vice president. Business came first for him. Politics arrived later, in that order, and not the reverse, whatever the volume of the campaign years suggests. During his father's presidential campaigns, he became the most visible surrogate the family could field, and he built out of that role a standing of his own in conservative politics that outlasted any individual election cycle. Ivanka Trump began at Georgetown University and transferred to Wharton after 2 years, graduating with a bachelor's degree in economics. She ran fashion businesses under her own name and worked inside the Trump Organization before moving to Washington, taking a post as a senior advisor in her father's administration. Her path since runs the other way. Having occupied one of the most photographed positions in American public life, she stepped away from politics almost entirely once the administration ended, which leaves her the only one of the three to move out of the arena rather than deeper into it. Eric Trump graduated from Georgetown University with a bachelor's degree in finance and management. Like his brother, he became an executive vice president at the Trump Organization, and the two of them run the daily operations of the family business between them. He remains politically active as a surrogate for his father. A divorce reported as the most public humiliation in the family's history produced 3 adults who walked straight into the company at the center of it. Comparisons between the three flatten what actually happened to each of them. Donald Jr. entered the business and then politics, Ivanka entered the business and then government, and then left public life altogether, and Eric stayed with the buildings and the balance sheets while speaking for his father whenever asked. They share a starting point. A childhood spent inside the company and a family breakdown conducted at a volume that left no room for private feeling produced 3 different accommodations out of the same inheritance. Ivana's part in that outcome rarely enters the discussion. She ran a casino resort and a hotel while her children remained small, and she held custody and the purse strings through the years in which the 3 of them worked out what to do with themselves. The children entered the business their father built, though the formation happened in a house their mother ran. Ivana spent none of the years after the divorce in retreat. She built an independent commercial career, selling fashion, jewelry, and beauty lines through television shopping networks, an outlet that reached exactly the audience which followed every day of her divorce. The commercial logic ran straight through the humiliation. Coverage that exposed her private life also handed her a name recognized in nearly every household in the country, and she converted that recognition into revenue with no apparent embarrassment about where it came from. A temptation exists to read the shopping channel years as a step down from running the plaza. The comparison misses what actually changed, because the products carried her own name rather than her husband's. The revenue arrived in her accounts rather than in a family company's, and a woman who spent a decade holding senior titles inside somebody else's empire now answered to nobody. This time, the name on the door belonged to her. She wrote as well. 2 novels appeared under her name, along with a 1995 self-help book called The Best Is Yet to Come, Coping with Divorce and Enjoying Life Again, addressed to women going through in private what she survived on the front pages. Its most quoted line advised divorced women to take his wallet to the cleaners. The joke worked because everyone reading it knew what she extracted from her own settlement, and the advice carried the authority of somebody who contested a prenuptial agreement and came out with $14 million. Her relationship with Donald Trump recovered over time. The two stayed in regular contact through her later years, and during his presidency, she occasionally passed along informal advice, a role no settlement document anticipated. Reconciliations of that kind occur less often than the story suggests. Most marriages that end in 11 days of tabloid coverage do not produce a friendship afterwards, and whatever the divorce cost either party, she remained close enough to be consulted. Her final years passed largely outside the tabloid frame that once defined her. She kept her businesses and her townhouse on the Upper East Side, and she reached 73 in the February of 2022 with all 3 children grown into public figures in their own right. Then a staircase ended it in an afternoon. Ivana Trump died on July 14, 2022, at the age of 73, in her townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The New York City Medical Examiner's Office ruled the death an accident, attributing it to blunt impact injuries to the torso sustained in a fall down a steep, spiraling staircase inside the house. Nothing dramatic appears in the finding, That ordinariness accounts for much of the difficulty in absorbing it, given everything the woman on that staircase crossed and outlasted before she reached it. A staircase in a private house ended a life that crossed a sealed border, built a career on 2 continents, ran a casino and a landmark hotel, and survived the most public divorce of its era. The tabloids covered the death too. Their tone shifted across the intervening 32 years, and the obituaries gave more room to the businesses and the children than the reporting of 1990 ever did. Though, the marriage still supplied the headline on most of them. Public memory of Ivana Trump has never quite settled. She surfaces first as the first wife, the accent, the confrontation on the slope at Aspen, and the settlement figure, and only somewhere after all of that as the executive who managed the Plaza Hotel. The unverifiable Olympic claim sits at the center of the problem, since parts of her biography came assembled for public consumption, and the assembly worked so well that the constructed version outlived the documented one. 3 children carry a surname she acquired at 28 and kept for the rest of her life, and 2 of them spent their adult careers inside American politics at a level she never approached herself. She controlled their schooling, their allowances, their custody, and the house they came home to. The story told about that family almost never runs through her. One physical trace of her work sits in the most obvious place available. The interiors of Trump Tower, the look she oversaw while holding the title of Vice President of Design, still draw visitors from all over the world, and almost none of them arrive knowing whose eye chose the finish of the lobby they photograph. She occupies the room without a name attached to her, which describes the rest of her legacy about as well as it describes the lobby. Rescuing a figure like this from obscurity does not quite describe the task. Ivana Trump never spent an obscure day after 1977. Somebody mislabeled her instead, filing her under a divorce rather than a career, and the thing that turned her into a household name across America also buried the record of the decade before it. What survives contradicts the label, the executive titles, the settlement she fought for and won, the deposition nobody has resolved, and 3 children who entered the family business anyway. Whether that record ever outruns the headline of 1990 remains an open question, and on the evidence so far, the headline keeps winning.